The divorce paperwork sat open on the kitchen island beside an untouched cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, its pale ring staining the wood like something permanent. Marcus Bennett stood near the sink in his dark work jacket, rainwater still drying on the shoulders, watching Vanessa scroll through luxury apartment listings on her glowing phone screen as if their marriage had already become old furniture waiting to be moved out. Outside, headlights from a black SUV rolled slowly across the wet suburban driveway before disappearing again. Vanessa barely looked up when she finally said it. "I can find better." The sentence landed softer than shouting would have, which somehow made it worse. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He just noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the phone afterward, like even she understood something irreversible had entered the room. "If you're watching from somewhere that's ever made you question someone's loyalty, let me know where you're listening from." Marcus pulled his lunch container from the fridge and quietly checked the digital clock above the stove. 10:47 p.m. Another 14-hour shift finished. Another night coming home to silence that felt less accidental every week. Vanessa used to wait up for him once. Used to ask about his routes, his drivers, his impossible scheduling disasters at the logistics company downtown. Now she barely looked away from her screen. Her polished reflection moved faintly in the dark kitchen window while rain slid down the glass outside. Marcus noticed small things because that was what his job trained him to do. Delays. Timing gaps. Behavioral changes. Patterns. Vanessa had started locking her phone 3 months ago. She suddenly cared about expensive restaurants neither of them used to mention. And lately, she kept comparing him to men he'd never met. Entrepreneurs. Investors. Men with freedom. Men who apparently didn't come home smelling like diesel, paperwork, and warehouse air. He walked past the island and finally glanced down at the divorce packet spread neatly beside her purse. A yellow sticky note from her attorney marked a paragraph about asset separation and refinancing options on the house. Marcus's eyes paused there longer than Vanessa probably expected. Not because he looked shocked. Because he noticed the date. The refinancing consultation had happened nearly 6 weeks earlier. Before their first serious conversation about separation. Before she'd even mentioned being unhappy out loud. Something about that timeline sat wrong in his chest. Vanessa finally looked at him then, her expression controlled but distant, like she'd already rehearsed this version of herself privately. "You've been checked out for years, Marcus." He nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging the statement existed. The quiet unsettled her more than anger would have. She stood and carried her wineglass toward the living room, crossing the kitchen slowly enough for him to catch another unfamiliar detail, a luxury gym membership card partially visible inside her purse. Different neighborhood. 40 minutes away. Marcus knew because one of his delivery routes passed that district every Thursday morning. The realization wasn't explosive. It was worse. It fit too cleanly beside everything else. Upstairs, the hallway light remained on although Vanessa usually complained about wasting electricity. Marcus looked toward the staircase and noticed a second phone charger plugged near the guest room wall. Not theirs. Not recent either. Tiny scratches marked the outlet plate like it had been there a while. Vanessa followed his eyes and immediately stepped between him and the stairs without seeming to realize she'd done it. That movement stayed with him more than her words. He grabbed the cold coffee from the counter and poured it into the sink. Neither of them spoke for almost 30 seconds. Rain tapped harder against the windows. Somewhere outside, tires hissed across wet pavement. Vanessa finally exhaled slowly. "You're a good man, Marcus. But I want more out of life." There it was again. Not anger. Evaluation. Like she was already mentally interviewing replacements while he still carried the mortgage, insurance, utilities, and most of the life surrounding her. Marcus leaned lightly against the counter, calm enough that people constantly mistook it for weakness. But inside his silence, things were already rearranging themselves. He thought about the refinancing documents. The attorney timeline. The hidden charger upstairs. The SUV outside. The fact that Vanessa sounded less emotional than prepared. And for the first time all night, Marcus stopped feeling like a husband standing inside a failing marriage. He felt like a man who had just walked halfway into a conversation everyone else around him started long before he arrived. Marcus barely slept after Vanessa's words settled into the house like permanent smoke. Around 4:30 in the morning, he walked downstairs and found the dining room light still on. Vanessa's laptop sat closed beside the divorce paperwork, but the yellow legal tab he noticed earlier had moved to a different section overnight. Property transfer options. Temporary occupancy agreements. The wording felt strangely advanced for a marriage that, according to her, had only recently become unhappy. Marcus stood silently beside the table, deep brown hands resting against the back of a chair while rain streaked across the windows behind him. Then he noticed something else. One line near the bottom referenced a financial consultation already completed under both names nearly 2 months earlier. Marcus's expression barely changed, but his eyes stayed fixed there longer this time. He tried remembering where he'd been that week. Dallas distribution crisis. 4 straight nights at the warehouse. Vanessa had told him she was visiting her cousin in Buckhead. Upstairs, floorboards shifted softly. Vanessa appeared halfway down the staircase wearing an oversized sweater instead of pajamas, phone glowing faintly in one hand before she quickly lowered it against her leg. She froze for half a second when she saw him looking at the paperwork. Not fear exactly. More like interruption. "You're up early," she said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "Couldn't sleep." Her eyes moved immediately toward the papers, then back to him. Tiny movement. Tiny panic. He'd spent 20 years in logistics watching people hide delays, damaged inventory, altered schedules. Most lies lived inside timing before words ever arrived. Vanessa walked into the kitchen without asking what he was reading and poured coffee she never drank, leaving the mug untouched beside the sink while checking her phone screen every few seconds. Marcus noticed the lock screen reflection briefly illuminate her face. A message banner disappeared too quickly to read fully, but one phrase stayed visible long enough to register: "He still doesn't know." Vanessa angled the phone away almost immediately afterward. She didn't realize Marcus had already seen enough. By 7:30, Marcus sat inside his truck outside the distribution center downtown while warehouse lights flickered against the wet morning pavement. He watched workers move through loading bays while replaying small inconsistencies from the past few months. Vanessa suddenly caring about refinancing. Her gym membership across town. The hidden consultation. The unfamiliar charger upstairs. The strange emotional certainty in her voice last night. None of it felt impulsive anymore. It felt structured. Like conversations had been happening around him while he was busy carrying the life they both lived. His assistant manager knocked lightly against the truck window, startling him out of the pattern forming in his head. "You good, Marcus?" Marcus answered automatically. "Yeah." But even as he stepped onto the loading dock, another detail surfaced. Vanessa had started insisting he work more overtime this year. More routes. More weekends. At the time he thought she wanted financial security. Standing beneath the harsh warehouse lights now, he realized something colder. Every extra shift also kept him physically away from home. Late that evening, Marcus returned earlier than usual without texting ahead. The house was quiet except for low voices drifting from the back patio through partially open sliding doors. He stopped in the dark hallway before entering the kitchen. Vanessa stood outside beneath the covered patio light, shoulders tense, speaking softly into her phone while rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters nearby. "No," she whispered sharply. "Not yet. He's starting to notice things." Marcus stayed perfectly still in the darkness beside the hallway wall. Vanessa turned slightly then, and through the reflection in the glass door, Marcus saw something that made the entire situation suddenly feel larger than a failing marriage. Resting on the patio table beside her wineglass sat a thick blue folder stamped with the logo of a private financial advisory firm Marcus had never heard her mention before. Marcus stayed motionless in the dark hallway while rain rattled softly against the patio roof outside. Vanessa's voice had dropped low enough that he could no longer hear complete sentences, but he didn't need them anymore. The blue financial advisory folder on the patio table already said enough. Vanessa had never cared about investments, tax strategies, or wealth management firms before. She used to hand Marcus unopened bank envelopes because she hated boring financial stuff. Now she was standing outside after midnight whispering into her phone beside documents connected to a private advisory company he had never once heard her mention. What unsettled him most wasn't the secrecy. It was the organization. The timing. The sense that everyone involved already understood the structure except him. Vanessa suddenly turned slightly, and Marcus stepped silently deeper into the hallway shadows before she re-entered the kitchen. Her expression looked composed at first glance, but her movements betrayed tension now. She immediately grabbed the blue folder from the patio table and slid it beneath a stack of magazines near the island counter without realizing Marcus had already seen the company logo clearly enough to remember it. Harrington Private Equity Advisors. The name stayed in his head long after she walked upstairs. Marcus didn't confront her. Didn't even ask questions. He simply poured himself water and noticed another unfamiliar detail waiting beside the sink, 2 valet parking receipts from a downtown hotel lounge dated 3 weeks apart. Same location. Same late-night timestamp. Vanessa had told him she was attending networking events with coworkers those nights. Marcus folded the receipts carefully and slipped them into his jacket pocket without expression. If you found something like that sitting in your own kitchen, would you ignore it or start digging deeper? The next afternoon, Marcus drove past the financial advisory office during his lunch break without fully planning to. The building stood inside a polished high-rise district far removed from warehouses and freight routes. Black SUVs lined the curb beneath muted glass towers while sharply dressed professionals crossed the lobby carrying leather portfolios. Marcus stayed inside his truck for almost 2 minutes watching people enter and leave through the revolving doors. Then he saw Vanessa. Not entering nervously like someone unfamiliar with the place. Walking out comfortably beside an older man in a tailored charcoal coat holding the same blue folder from the patio. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but it carried the quiet familiarity of repeated meetings. The man touched Vanessa lightly near her elbow while speaking. Vanessa smiled in a way Marcus hadn't seen directed at him in months. Not romantic exactly. More aligned. Coordinated. The painful realization hit him slowly instead of dramatically. Vanessa hadn't simply become unhappy. She had already built another version of her life somewhere outside his visibility. Marcus remained parked across the street while late afternoon light reflected off the wet pavement between them. Vanessa entered the passenger side of a black SUV and drove away with the man before Marcus could even process why the sight bothered him beyond marriage. Something about the social imbalance felt deeper now. Vanessa had started treating him less like a husband and more like an obstacle still occupying space inside plans already moving forward without him. That evening, Marcus returned home to find the upstairs guest room door partially open for the first time in weeks. Inside, stacked neatly beside the bed, sat 3 banker boxes filled with documents, old tax returns, property records, insurance folders, and mortgage paperwork Marcus hadn't seen in years. He crouched quietly beside the nearest box, scanning labels under the dim hallway light. Most were ordinary at first glance. Until he noticed several folders missing from the family filing system entirely. Retirement accounts. Original property purchase agreements. Life insurance amendments. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the dates attached to the missing records. Some had disappeared nearly 8 months earlier. Long before Vanessa ever mentioned divorce. Then he heard footsteps downstairs followed by Vanessa laughing softly into her phone again, comfortable enough now that she no longer whispered every conversation. Marcus stayed frozen beside the open document box while a colder realization slowly settled into place. Whatever Vanessa was building behind his back didn't begin recently. He was only just arriving at the edge of something that may have already been operating quietly around him for almost a year. Marcus closed the guest room box carefully and slid it back into place exactly the way he found it before Vanessa came upstairs. By morning, confusion had already hardened into something colder and more useful. Pattern recognition. He drove to work before sunrise while the city still glowed blue beneath low rain clouds, mentally arranging dates, documents, and behavioral shifts the same way he organized freight routes during crisis weeks. 8 months ago Vanessa suddenly pushed him toward heavier overtime. 7 months ago she stopped asking about household finances. 6 months ago came the refinancing consultation. Then the hidden accounts disappeared from their filing system. The timeline no longer looked emotional. It looked operational. Marcus sat inside the distribution center parking lot watching late trucks back into loading bays while his phone illuminated another detail he almost ignored before. A bank alert from one of their joint credit accounts. Vanessa had spent nearly $4,000 at a furniture staging company downtown 3 days earlier. Marcus frowned slightly. They weren't remodeling. They weren't moving yet either. He quietly searched the company during his lunch break and discovered the business specialized in preparing upscale homes for sale. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Vanessa wasn't just planning divorce paperwork anymore. She was planning presentation, optics, transition. And somehow she had access to financial movement before conversations ever reached him. That afternoon Marcus requested copies of archived mortgage correspondence from the company portal under the excuse of updating tax records. Inside the digital folder, another inconsistency surfaced almost immediately. A secondary email address had been added to their account months ago without his knowledge. Not Vanessa's normal email. A professional domain connected to Harrington Private Equity Advisors. Marcus stared at the screen in silence inside his office while warehouse noise echoed faintly outside the glass walls. Someone from that firm wasn't casually advising Vanessa anymore. They had direct visibility into marital property records. His eyes moved slowly through the account activity timestamps. Multiple access logins. Late-night downloads. Property valuation requests. Marcus leaned back in his chair, controlled but increasingly aware he was standing outside a system already moving around him. The most unsettling part wasn't that Vanessa hid things. It was how coordinated the access looked. Later that evening, Marcus arrived home to find Vanessa dressed for dinner in a dark fitted coat he hadn't seen in months. Her makeup looked sharper than usual. Intentional. She barely acknowledged him while fastening an earring in the hallway mirror. Dinner with co-workers, she said before he even asked. The sentence arrived too quickly, like it had been prepared in advance. Marcus nodded once and stepped aside quietly. But as Vanessa reached for her purse, a folded valet receipt slipped partially from the side pocket again. Same downtown hotel lounge. Same private parking garage. Different date. Third time now. Vanessa noticed his eyes lower briefly toward the receipt and her entire posture tightened for half a second before smoothing again. Tiny reaction. Tiny confirmation. Marcus said nothing. That silence seemed to disturb her more each day. Around 9:30 that night, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen island beneath dim pendant lights while rain moved softly across the windows again. The house felt less like a home now and more like a waiting room for something already decided elsewhere. He opened the shared laptop Vanessa occasionally used for streaming subscriptions and noticed an unfamiliar browser tab left active accidentally. Not messages. Not photos. A gated property listing portal connected to luxury condos downtown. Several units had already been bookmarked under a user profile containing Vanessa's initials alongside another name partially hidden by the browser edge. Marcus's breathing slowed almost imperceptibly as he clicked nothing and simply observed. Then his eyes locked onto the profile creation date in the upper corner. 11 months earlier. Nearly a full year before Vanessa ever told him she was unhappy. Marcus barely slept after seeing the condo profile timestamp. 11 months. Long before the arguments. Long before Vanessa started talking about space and growth and how he was too comfortable with ordinary life. By sunrise, the realization no longer felt emotional. It felt structured. He stood alone in the kitchen while pale morning light reflected against untouched coffee cups and the framed wedding photo still hanging near the hallway entrance. In the picture, Vanessa leaned against him with effortless warmth that now felt almost historical. Marcus studied the image quietly, not with heartbreak anymore, but with the unsettling awareness that he might have been living inside a transition plan for nearly a year without realizing it. Later that afternoon, Marcus noticed another shift that seemed small on the surface but stayed with him all day. Two supervisors at the distribution center suddenly treated him differently during a logistics meeting. More polite. Slightly distant. One of them awkwardly avoided eye contact when Marcus mentioned taking extra overtime next quarter. Then his phone buzzed with an automated HR notification confirming that his emergency contact information had recently been reviewed online. Marcus never touched it. He opened the account during break and saw the access came from an external IP address connected to a downtown business network. Same district as Harrington Private Equity Advisors. Same district as the luxury condo listings. Marcus felt the pressure inside the situation widen quietly around him. Vanessa didn't just know people anymore. She had access moving through systems connected to his finances, employment records, and future planning. That night rain hit the windows harder while Vanessa moved around the bedroom gathering clothes for another, overnight work retreat. Marcus watched carefully without appearing to watch. Her routines had become too polished. Too rehearsed. Even her silences now sounded coordinated. As she zipped her bag, her phone lit briefly on the dresser from an incoming message preview. Marcus only caught fragments before the screen faded dark again. Tomorrow confirmed, attorney already prepared. Vanessa grabbed the phone instantly afterward, but not before Marcus noticed the sender's last name. Whitmore. Same surname printed on one of the refinance consultation packets months earlier. The same packet Vanessa claimed was just preliminary information. Marcus said nothing while she left the room, but another pattern locked into place inside his mind. Legal coordination. Financial coordination. Housing coordination. Multiple people moving carefully around the same outcome. Near midnight Marcus drove downtown instead of going home immediately after work. He parked across from the hotel garage appearing on all three valet receipts and watched black SUVs slide beneath the glowing entrance canopy while rain blurred city lights across the windshield. 40 minutes later, Vanessa emerged beside a tall man in a charcoal coat carrying a leather document case. Not romantic. Worse. Professional. The man handed her something small near the curb before both paused as another older couple approached them with strange familiarity. Vanessa smiled politely, introducing herself with the smooth confidence of someone already operating inside a new social circle. Marcus noticed how naturally the others accepted her. No hesitation. No surprise. As if she had existed in their world far longer than he knew. He stayed still in the dark car, observing details instead of reacting emotionally. Then the older man shook hands with Vanessa's companion and said something Marcus couldn't hear clearly through the rain except for two distinct words carried faintly across the street. Settlement structure. Marcus's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Settlement. Not possibility. Not discussion. Structure. The language sounded finalized already. On the drive home, Marcus replayed every timeline inconsistency again. The refinance meeting. The hidden account access. The staged condo listings. The attorney messages. The professional introductions. None of this felt spontaneous anymore. By the time he pulled into the driveway, another vehicle sat briefly across the street with headlights off before slowly driving away the moment Marcus parked. Not random. Not neighborhood traffic. Marcus remained inside his truck watching the empty road through rain-streaked glass while a cold realization settled deeper than anything before. He was no longer dealing with one betrayal inside a failing marriage. He was standing outside a coordinated network that seemed to know exactly where his life was heading long before he did. Marcus stayed inside the parked truck long after the vehicle across the street disappeared into the rain. The windshield fogged slowly while porch lights reflected across wet pavement, and for the first time since the marriage began unraveling, he stopped viewing the situation as betrayal alone. Betrayal was emotional. This felt infrastructural. Too many people already knew where his life was heading before he did. Too many systems had quietly shifted around him without resistance. When Marcus finally walked inside, Vanessa was asleep upstairs, her phone charging beside the bed with the screen facing downward now every night like clockwork. Marcus stood silently in the hallway outside their bedroom and realized something colder than anger settling into place. He had spent years believing exhaustion made him invisible. But invisibility worked both ways. The next morning Marcus used an old logistics contact to quietly pull public ownership records connected to the downtown condo development. What surfaced made his chest tighten almost imperceptibly. Harrington Private Equity Advisors didn't just finance luxury properties. The firm specialized in asset restructuring during high-net-worth divorces and estate transitions. Marcus read through archived corporate filings during lunch beneath harsh warehouse office lighting while rain hammered the loading docks outside. Multiple shell LLCs, real estate transfers. Temporary trust structures. Strategic liquidation language. Vanessa's refinance consultant, the attorney named Whitmore, and several property managers all appeared repeatedly across the same corporate ecosystem. This wasn't random networking anymore. It was coordinated positioning. And somehow Vanessa had been folded into it months before their marriage visibly started collapsing. If you've ever realized people were quietly moving pieces around your life before you even understood the game, you already know how dangerous that feeling is. Marcus kept scrolling. One detail stopped him cold. A secondary holding company tied to the condo project listed a silent partner under initials matching Vanessa's maiden name. Not direct ownership. Proxy positioning. The amount attached wasn't enormous, but it was enough to imply future access, future inclusion, future reward. Marcus leaned back slowly in the office chair while forklifts moved behind glass walls outside. Vanessa wasn't just preparing to leave. Someone had been preparing a landing place for her. Socially. Financially. Legally. That evening Vanessa invited him unexpectedly to a charity gala downtown connected to one of her consulting clients. The invitation itself felt strange. For months she avoided public appearances with him unless necessary. Yet now she insisted he come. Marcus noticed the subtle pressure immediately. She even picked his tie herself before they left, correcting his collar with distant politeness that felt almost performative. The event unfolded inside a luxury hotel ballroom glowing with soft gold light and controlled conversation. Men in tailored coats exchanged quiet business language near bourbon tables while women moved through the room with polished confidence. Marcus recognized several faces from corporate filings he had reviewed hours earlier. Whitmore. The older couple from outside the hotel garage. Two executives connected to Harrington Holdings. And Vanessa seemed completely comfortable among them. Worse than comfortable. Integrated. Marcus remained calm beside her while watching interactions carefully. Certain conversations paused subtly when he approached. Certain glances lingered too long. One executive shook Marcus's hand with overly rehearsed warmth before asking, "Still handling operations out in Jersey?" The wording stayed with Marcus immediately. Out in Jersey. Like his entire life had already been categorized as separate from theirs. Smaller. Peripheral. Meanwhile Vanessa stood beside them holding champagne with the composed posture of someone auditioning for entry into another class of life entirely. Later near the ballroom entrance, Marcus excused himself quietly and walked toward the private conference corridor outside the main event space. Through partially closed glass doors he caught sight of folders spread across a boardroom table beside illuminated financial projections. One document displayed a familiar address. Their house. Marcus stopped moving. Another line underneath referenced, anticipated transfer timeline following marital dissolution. His expression never changed, but inside him something shifted permanently. This was no longer suspicion. Their future had already been modeled financially inside rooms he was never supposed to enter. Then Marcus noticed one final detail that made the entire structure around him feel even larger and older than he imagined. Printed near the bottom of the document was a trust name connected to Vanessa's late father's estate, a trust established nearly 3 years before she ever told Marcus she was unhappy. Marcus left the gala without changing expression, but the boardroom image stayed locked in his mind the entire drive home. Their house listed inside a projected dissolution plan. Estimated transfer timelines. Financial redistribution models. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was infrastructure disguised as inevitability. Rain streaked across the windshield while downtown towers disappeared behind him in soft gold reflections, and for the first time Marcus stopped asking whether Vanessa planned to leave him. The real question now was how many people had already built careers, investments, and future leverage around the assumption that he would lose everything quietly. When he entered the house, Vanessa was already asleep upstairs again, one arm draped across untouched sheets while her phone glowed faintly beside the bed. Marcus didn't touch it. He simply stood in the doorway studying the room with new awareness. Nothing inside this marriage felt spontaneous anymore. Over the next week Marcus changed nothing externally. He still worked overtime. Still answered politely. Still let Vanessa believe exhaustion kept him unaware. But internally, something shifted into disciplined observation. He began documenting timelines privately during breaks at work, building spreadsheets inside an old logistics archive account nobody else would think to check. Property dates. Account access logs. Corporate filings. Attorney overlaps. Trust names. Social connections. Every pattern widened the same direction. The hidden system around Vanessa wasn't emotional chaos. It was organized transition management supported by legal, financial, and social alliances operating years ahead of ordinary people. And everyone inside that system seemed convinced Marcus was too overworked and too ordinary to ever understand it. One evening Marcus returned home early after a cancelled shipment delay and noticed Vanessa speaking quietly inside the garage before she realized he was there. Her posture changed instantly the moment she saw him. Calm smile. Relaxed tone. Too fast. Marcus glanced briefly toward the dark SUV idling outside the driveway before it pulled away without hesitation. Vanessa casually explained it as a consultant dropping paperwork, but Marcus's eyes settled on the folder in her hand. Harrington letterhead again. This time partially covered by a family estate seal he recognized from the gala documents. Vanessa tucked it away almost immediately, yet not before Marcus noticed another name beneath the trust title. Davenport Holdings. The surname hit him unexpectedly. Marcus had seen it years earlier during a difficult period after Vanessa's father died. Old money. Property influence. Political donations. Quiet regional power. Suddenly the scale behind everything expanded again. Vanessa wasn't climbing socially at random. She was being positioned deliberately around legacy structures older than their marriage itself. Marcus said nothing while walking past her into the kitchen. Silence had become more useful than confrontation now. Days later Marcus used an old union contact to quietly request archived county filings tied to Davenport Holdings properties. The records revealed layered LLCs connected to redevelopment projects, divorce restructuring firms, and trust-managed estates across multiple states. One recurring pattern stood out immediately: spouses removed slowly from shared ownership before public separation announcements finalized. Not illegal. just strategic. Marcus sat alone inside the dim warehouse office long after midnight, staring at spreadsheets glowing across the monitor while forklifts rested silent below. The realization wasn't just personal anymore. He had wandered accidentally into a machine designed to redistribute power quietly while people like him stayed emotionally distracted. And the system clearly believed he would remain distracted until the end. Later that same night, Marcus received an unexpected email from an unfamiliar private address containing only a courthouse appointment confirmation scheduled under Vanessa's name for the following Tuesday morning. No message attached. No explanation. Just the timestamp, courtroom number, and attached filing category, Preliminary Asset Review Conference. Marcus stared at the screen while rain tapped softly against dark office windows. He never told anyone he knew about the filings. Which meant one of two things now felt true. Either someone inside the system wanted him informed deliberately, or someone else inside it had quietly started positioning against Vanessa and the people around her. Marcus read the anonymous courthouse appointment 3 times before deleting nothing and replying to no one. The sender clearly understood how sensitive the information was. More importantly, they understood timing. Whoever sent it waited until Marcus had already uncovered enough of the structure to recognize what the filing meant. Preliminary asset review conferences weren't emotional conversations. They were preparation stages. Quiet positioning before separation became public. Marcus leaned back inside the dark office while warehouse lights dimmed automatically 1 row at a time below him, and for the first time in weeks, the pressure inside his chest shifted into something steadier. Direction. Someone inside the system either underestimated him badly, or intentionally wanted him armed with information before the next move happened. Tuesday morning, Marcus parked across from the courthouse instead of entering immediately. Rain moved softly across black stone steps while attorneys in tailored coats crossed through security with practiced efficiency. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later in a charcoal blazer Marcus had bought her years earlier, before promotions, before social circles changed, before all this invisible infrastructure formed around them. She wasn't alone. Whitmore walked beside her carrying a thin leather portfolio while another older man Marcus recognized from the gala followed several steps behind. Davenport Legal Counsel. Marcus remained inside the truck watching carefully. What struck him most wasn't secrecy anymore. It was confidence. None of them moved like people afraid of being discovered. They moved like people operating within protected assumptions. Marcus finally entered the building separately and stayed 1 floor above the scheduled conference room. From the quiet courthouse corridor, he observed attorneys, assistants, and consultants flowing in and out of adjacent offices carrying folders stamped with estate codes and holding company initials he now recognized instantly. Harrington. Davenport. Whitmore Legal Advisory. The same names repeated through every layer. Marcus sat silently near a rain-darkened window pretending to review work emails while listening carefully to fragmented conversations drifting through partially opened office doors. Transition exposure, asset shielding, spousal predictability, the language sounded clinical. Almost mechanical. As though ordinary marriages had become financial events optimized by systems long before emotions ever surfaced publicly. Marcus's expression remained calm, but internally another realization settled into place. The people around Vanessa weren't improvising. They specialized in outcomes. Later that afternoon, Marcus drove toward an address buried inside one of the LLC filings he archived earlier in the week. The property sat behind iron gates outside the city, not extravagant, but old money discreet. Large trees. Stone walls. Security cameras positioned subtly beneath eaves. A black SUV rested near the entrance while 2 men in business coats exited carrying document cases. Marcus stayed parked across the road long enough to notice another familiar detail, Vanessa's car already inside the property. She never mentioned this place once during their marriage. Yet she entered without hesitation. No security check. No introductions. Just access. The realization widened the board again. Vanessa wasn't being invited gradually anymore. She already belonged somewhere Marcus had never even seen. But instead of anger, Marcus felt calculation sharpening quietly beneath the surface. Because the more he observed, the clearer another truth became. Everyone inside this network relied on one assumption to keep functioning smoothly, that Marcus would stay emotionally reactive, exhausted, financially distracted, and socially small. That assumption had become their blind spot. That night Marcus opened an old safety deposit file his late uncle left him years ago after helping Marcus through a difficult financial collapse long before he met Vanessa. Most of the contents were ordinary records Marcus rarely thought about anymore until now. Property maps. Business contracts. Archived ownership transfers. But buried beneath them sat a sealed partnership amendment connected to a regional logistics cooperative Marcus quietly invested in years earlier using overtime savings nobody around him ever respected enough to ask about. Marcus studied the document beneath dim kitchen light while the house remained silent upstairs. The cooperative now controlled distribution rights tied to multiple redevelopment zones, including 2 properties connected directly to Davenport Holdings projects currently under restructuring review. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time in weeks. Because suddenly the balance inside the entire system around him no longer looked untouchable. And for the first time, Marcus realized he might already possess leverage powerful enough to force people far above Vanessa to pay attention. Marcus locked the partnership amendment back inside the metal file case and sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight while rain softened against the windows. The document changed more than his leverage. It changed perspective. For weeks he had viewed himself as a man trapped outside an invisible structure designed by wealthier, more connected people. But the logistics cooperative revealed something different. He already existed inside parts of their system, quietly, indirectly, unnoticed. The same redevelopment corridors Davenport Holdings depended on for future expansion relied partially on regional distribution access controlled through agreements Marcus inherited and expanded years earlier while everyone around him dismissed him as just another exhausted operations manager working overtime to survive. Upstairs Vanessa slept peacefully, unaware the balance beneath the floorboards had already started shifting. Over the following days Marcus became more deliberate. Calmer. Vanessa noticed the change immediately even if she couldn't fully place it. He stopped asking questions altogether. Stopped reacting to her emotional distance. Stopped trying to repair conversations already hollowed out months earlier. That silence altered the atmosphere inside the house more than any argument could have. One evening during dinner Vanessa casually mentioned an upcoming, networking retreat at a luxury hotel outside the city attended by several investors and legal consultants. Her tone carried subtle superiority now, like she was slowly stepping into a future Marcus no longer fit inside. But Marcus only nodded while eating quietly beneath the soft kitchen lights. The controlled response unsettled her slightly. He saw it in the tiny hesitation before she reached for her wine glass. People expected emotional men to reveal themselves through frustration. Marcus was becoming unreadable instead. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is already 10 steps ahead. A few days later Marcus arrived early to a private meeting requested through one of the logistics cooperative contacts tied to the redevelopment zones. The boardroom overlooked dark river water beneath gray afternoon skies while polished executives reviewed transportation forecasts projected across glass screens. Marcus entered wearing the same understated coat he wore to work every winter, and several people barely acknowledged him at first. Then the conversation shifted when one senior advisor quietly referenced distribution access delays tied to Davenport expansion schedules. Marcus listened calmly while realizing none of them recognized his name connected to the partnership holdings yet. Hidden ownership had protected him accidentally all these years. The realization created something dangerous, asymmetry. They understood the system. But they still misunderstood him completely. Marcus left the meeting with new documents secured inside a plain leather folder and drove downtown beneath glowing city lights reflecting across rain-darkened streets. On impulse he stopped outside the same luxury hotel where Vanessa's retreat would happen the following evening. Black SUVs lined the entrance already. Security personnel moved discreetly through the lobby. Through tall glass windows Marcus noticed Whitmore speaking with several Davenport representatives beside a private dining room entrance while hotel staff prepared tables inside. Then Marcus caught sight of Vanessa descending the staircase wearing a fitted cream coat and moving comfortably through the environment like someone already rehearsing another version of her life. One executive handed her a folder while another smiled approvingly. Not flirtation. Evaluation. Positioning. Marcus stayed across the street watching carefully, understanding now that Vanessa's confidence came from believing powerful people had already secured her landing. But power structures built around assumptions became vulnerable the moment one assumption failed. And Marcus intended to let everyone keep underestimating him until the exact second it became catastrophic. Later that night Marcus received another anonymous message, this time containing only a location, a time, and one sentence attached beneath it. They're planning the public announcement sooner than you think. Marcus stared at the glowing screen while thunder rolled softly beyond the city skyline. Then he opened the leather folder from the cooperative meeting again and slowly turned toward the final page, a contractual clause capable of freezing multiple Davenport redevelopment approvals if certain distribution obligations were challenged legally. Marcus's eyes settled on the signatures at the bottom while a slow realization formed beneath his calm expression. He no longer just understood the system surrounding him. He had finally located the pressure point capable of threatening the entire structure at once. Marcus arrived at the downtown hotel ballroom 40 minutes before the Davenport redevelopment reception officially began. Rain streaked across the glass facade while black SUVs unloaded investors, attorneys, and city officials beneath glowing entrance lights. Inside, polished marble floors reflected clusters of wealthy guests moving through carefully rehearsed conversations about expansion districts, tax incentives, and community transformation. Marcus blended into the background almost immediately in his charcoal coat and simple black tie. That invisibility had become useful now. Across the room Vanessa stood beside Ethan Whitmore near the champagne display, laughing softly while several executives treated her less like a former spouse and more like a future strategic partner. Marcus noticed the subtle shift instantly. She carried herself differently tonight, shoulders straighter, voice calmer, eyes filled with certainty. She truly believed she had already crossed into a higher world he could never reach. But certainty made people careless. Marcus understood that better than anyone in the room. He stayed near the rear of the ballroom observing the guest flow while giant projection screens displayed architectural renderings for Davenport's newest redevelopment corridor. Then one slide appeared showing transportation integration zones tied directly to the same logistics network clause hidden inside Marcus's file case. The realization tightened something quiet inside his chest. They weren't preparing for a future project anymore. They were already publicly positioning ownership expectations around infrastructure they legally did not fully control yet. Which meant their timeline had accelerated. And desperate people accelerated mistakes. Near the bar Marcus overheard two attorneys discussing emergency approvals expected within 72 hours pending final partnership certifications. One of them referenced the cooperative signatures, with casual confidence, as if the outcome had already been secured privately weeks ago. Marcus kept his expression neutral while sipping untouched bourbon beneath dim gold lighting. The pressure inside the room felt invisible but immense now, an entire network of reputations, investments, political promises, and personal ambitions balanced on paperwork most people assumed nobody would ever challenge. Vanessa finally noticed him standing near the back wall. Her smile faltered for less than a second before she recovered and crossed the ballroom gracefully. "You actually came," she said softly, though the surprise beneath her tone was impossible to miss. Marcus nodded calmly. "You said it was important." She studied him carefully then glanced toward Whitmore speaking with city officials near the stage. "Marcus, tonight isn't really the place for misunderstandings or emotional scenes." The phrasing settled between them like quiet humiliation. She still believed he was emotionally behind the situation. Still believed he had come hoping to save something already gone. Marcus simply looked past her toward the presentation screens glowing above the crowd. "I'm not here for a scene," he answered evenly. The response unsettled her more than anger would have. Across the ballroom Whitmore finally approached with the relaxed confidence of a man certain he controlled every variable in the room. He shook Marcus's hand politely but without warmth. "Good to finally see you supporting Vanessa," he said, almost performative for the nearby investors listening closely. Transitions are never easy. Marcus noticed several guests quietly watching the interaction now, measuring status through body language alone. Whitmore positioned himself subtly between Marcus and the executive circle near the stage, a territorial gesture disguised as politeness. Vanessa remained silent beside him. That silence confirmed more than any confession could. Marcus only nodded once. "Transitions usually reveal who prepared properly," he replied. For the first time that evening Whitmore's smile weakened slightly. Later, while applause filled the ballroom for Davenport's public redevelopment announcement, Marcus stepped quietly into an empty corridor outside the main event hall. Rain hammered the dark windows overlooking the city below while his phone vibrated again. This time the message contained a single attachment: scanned copies of internal transfer agreements signed months earlier using authorization tied indirectly to Vanessa's legal access during the marriage. Marcus stared at the glowing documents as his breathing slowed instead of quickened. The structure finally became clear. They had not only planned to replace him socially. They had already begun positioning him as the silent liability underneath their expansion network if anything collapsed publicly. At the very bottom of the final page sat tomorrow morning's courthouse filing schedule and one line highlighted in red: "Final controlling signatures pending witness confirmation." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes toward the ballroom doors where laughter and applause still echoed beyond the walls. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket and started walking toward the private elevator leading upstairs to the executive conference level, the same floor where the final signatures would be completed before sunrise. The private executive conference floor felt almost silent compared to the ballroom downstairs. Thick carpet muted every footstep while rain pressed against the dark glass walls overlooking downtown Atlanta. Marcus stepped out of the elevator and immediately noticed security outside the largest conference suite. Two men in tailored suits checked names against tablets while assistants moved sealed folders between rooms with rehearsed urgency. Nobody expected Marcus to belong there. That assumption still protected him. One of the assistants glanced at him briefly before holding the door open automatically, mistaking him for another legal representative tied to the Davenport filings. Marcus entered without hesitation. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from celebration to controlled pressure. Attorneys sat around a polished walnut table reviewing revised contracts under cold white lighting while Ethan Whitmore stood near the window speaking quietly with city officials. Vanessa remained beside him, though the confidence she carried downstairs had faded slightly now that real signatures and legal exposure were involved. Marcus immediately recognized several names printed across the top documents spread around the room: Shell development entities connected indirectly to properties his grandfather's transportation trust still partially controlled. Not publicly. Not visibly. But legally enough to stop everything if challenged correctly. And suddenly Marcus understood why Whitmore had moved so aggressively to isolate him socially first. They never expected him to understand the structure before final execution. One attorney finally looked up from the paperwork and froze slightly. "Mr. Holloway." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Ethan turned slowly, surprise flashing across his face before he forced composure back into place. Vanessa's expression changed more dramatically. Not panic yet. Something worse. Confusion. Because Marcus was not supposed to be standing there calmly holding a leather folder while half the room suddenly looked uncertain. Ethan recovered first. "This meeting is restricted," he said evenly. Marcus nodded once and placed his folder carefully onto the conference table. "That depends on whether you're discussing Davenport expansion," he replied quietly, "or attempting to transfer operational authority through incomplete ownership disclosure." Silence spread instantly across the room. One of the attorneys opened Marcus's folder cautiously while another leaned closer beside him. Marcus watched the exact second their posture changed. It happened subtly, shoulders tightening, eyes narrowing, breathing slowing. Recognition. The transportation corridor clauses. The trust attachments. The dormant ownership triggers tied to infrastructure access. For months everyone treated Marcus like emotional collateral left behind after a divorce. But now those same people were staring at paperwork carrying his legal authority directly through the center of their billion-dollar redevelopment structure. Vanessa stepped toward the table slowly. Marcus, her voice sounded unfamiliar now, stripped of the quiet superiority she carried all evening. Why do you have those files? He looked at her calmly. Because my name was never removed from the controlling trust. Another attorney interrupted before she could respond. If these documents are valid, this entire approval process requires immediate suspension pending review. Ethan's jaw tightened visibly for the first time since Marcus had met him. That's not necessary, he said sharply. We already verified. No, the older attorney cut in firmly while turning pages faster now. You verified operational partnerships. Not inheritance-linked control structures. The room's balance shifted again. Assistants stopped moving. Security near the doorway exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus remained still beside the table while conversations fractured around him in increasingly controlled panic. Downstairs applause still echoed faintly from the ballroom celebration, but up here the system underneath it had begun cracking open in real time. Vanessa stared at Marcus now like she was seeing a stranger emerge from underneath years of assumptions. Not because he raised his voice. Not because he threatened anyone. Because he had walked quietly into the center of a machine designed to erase him, and understood it better than the people running it. Ethan suddenly demanded a private recess with counsel, but before anyone moved another attorney opened the final attachment buried inside Marcus's folder. His expression hardened immediately. Wait, he said slowly. If this secondary authorization filing was submitted last month, the sentence stopped halfway. Every eye in the room shifted toward Marcus at once. Because hidden beneath the trust documentation sat something even larger than ownership leverage, a sealed contingency clause capable of freezing not just the Davenport project, but multiple connected financial partnerships tied to Whitmore Development itself. And judging by the silence swallowing the room now, they had just realized the collapse would not stop with tonight. The conference room no longer felt like a place where deals were negotiated. It felt like a structure collapsing in slow motion while everyone inside tried desperately to pretend they still had control. Rain streaked down the black windows overlooking Atlanta while attorneys spoke in low, urgent voices around Marcus, flipping through trust attachments and contingency clauses with growing disbelief. Ethan Whitmore had stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. The confidence that carried him through the gala downstairs had drained from his face, replaced now by the rigid stillness of someone calculating damage faster than they could contain it. Marcus remained standing near the end of the walnut table, calm, hands resting loosely near the folder that had just dismantled months of hidden maneuvering. Nobody looked at him the same way anymore. One attorney quietly confirmed what the others were already beginning to fear. If Marcus enforced the dormant authority provisions tied to the Transportation Trust, every financing partner connected to Whitmore Development would be legally required to suspend approval reviews immediately pending ownership litigation. That meant investors, public boards, city contracts, banking exposure. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Vanessa looked from one attorney to another like she was waiting for someone to restore the version of reality she still wanted to believe in. But nobody did. One of Whitmore's legal advisors finally spoke carefully. If this enters public review, your expansion network becomes discoverable. Ethan snapped toward him. We can settle this privately. Marcus noticed how quickly the language had changed. Hours earlier Ethan treated him like an inconvenience from Vanessa's past. Now the word settle entered the room. Not because Marcus threatened anyone. Because they had finally realized he possessed the leverage to expose structures far larger than their relationship. Vanessa stepped closer slowly, eyes fixed on Marcus now with something dangerously close to panic underneath the composure. "You knew?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not all of it," he said. "Just enough to realize everyone around me was making decisions assuming I'd never look deeper." The words landed harder than anger could have. Across the table, another attorney opened additional archived filings tied to the Davenport corridor acquisitions. Marcus watched the exact second recognition spread through the room again. Multiple properties Whitmore Development had quietly leveraged for future infrastructure control were partially routed through layered entities connected indirectly to Marcus's grandfather's original holdings. Not symbolic ownership. Operational ownership. Enough to freeze major redevelopment access if challenged publicly. Ethan's composure cracked visibly this time. This was supposed to be resolved years ago. Marcus noticed several attorneys exchange quick glances at that sentence. Wrong sentence. Too revealing. Vanessa turned sharply toward Ethan now, confusion cutting through her panic. "Resolved," she repeated softly. But Ethan didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Marcus saw the first real fracture between them. Not romantic. Strategic. She had not known everything either. That realization hit her harder than the legal exposure. Because for the first time all night, Vanessa looked less like a partner and more like someone who had also been positioned inside a machine she never fully understood. Another escalation arrived minutes later when two additional executives entered the conference suite carrying tablets filled with emergency investor notifications already leaking through internal channels. Someone downstairs had noticed the legal halt requests appearing across the project network. Calls were coming in from board members. Financial partners were requesting clarification. One executive whispered something to Ethan that caused the color to leave his face entirely. Marcus didn't hear the full sentence, only fragments. Bank review, suspended exposure, press risk, the room shifted again. Not just private collapse now. Public consequence. Vanessa sat slowly into one of the leather chairs near the end of the table, staring at the documents spread before her like they belonged to someone else's life. Her polished certainty was gone. Marcus noticed her fingers trembling slightly near her untouched champagne glass. 2 years earlier she had looked at him across their kitchen table and calmly explained she deserved someone, operating on a higher level. Tonight she was finally seeing the level Marcus had been operating on the entire time, quietly, patiently, without needing applause or performance. The humiliation wasn't that he won. It was realizing how badly she had misunderstood him. Security outside the conference suite increased as more executives arrived upstairs, trying to contain fallout before the gala crowd sensed something was wrong. But containment no longer mattered. The system had already cracked open. Marcus gathered his folder slowly while attorneys continued arguing around him in increasingly strained voices. Nobody tried stopping him now. Nobody dismissed him anymore. As he moved toward the elevator, Vanessa finally stood again. "Marcus," her voice broke slightly this time. He paused but didn't turn fully around. Behind him, the empire she chose over him was unraveling under fluorescent lights and legal language. And from the silence hanging in her voice, Marcus realized the final consequence had not fully reached her yet. Because losing the project, the status, the money, that was only the visible collapse. The deeper realization waiting for her was far more permanent. She had spent years trying to replace a man she never actually understood. By the time Marcus stepped out of the Davenport Tower, the rain had finally stopped. The city below shimmered under fading midnight lights while black SUVs pulled quietly away from the curb carrying attorneys, executives, and damage control teams into a future none of them had expected 12 hours earlier. The cold pressure that had lived inside Marcus for 2 years no longer felt heavy. Not because everything suddenly became easy. Because the truth no longer needed defending. He stood beneath the glass awning for a moment, breathing slowly while the revolving doors behind him continued turning with nervous urgency. Upstairs, investors were still arguing over emergency reviews and suspended approvals. Ethan Whitmore's expansion project had entered formal legal containment before sunrise. The empire built around quiet assumptions and carefully managed appearances was now trapped under public scrutiny and inheritance law. And Marcus had dismantled it without raising his voice once. 3 weeks later, the final agreements closed quietly inside a private legal office overlooking Midtown. Morning sunlight stretched across polished wood floors while attorneys reviewed the final restructuring documents tied to the Transportation Trust. Marcus signed calmly, restoring operational authority to the Holloway Holdings exactly the way his grandfather originally intended decades earlier. No reporters. No dramatic press conference. Just legal closure. One of the senior attorneys paused before leaving and looked at Marcus differently than he had during their first meeting months ago. Not with pity. Not with dismissal. Respect. Most people would have burned everything down publicly, the man said carefully. Marcus closed the folder slowly. Then everybody loses. The attorney nodded once before exiting quietly. And for the first time in years, the room finally felt still. Vanessa called him only once after the collapse became public. Marcus answered because avoiding her no longer mattered. Her voice sounded smaller now, stripped of the polished certainty that used to fill every silence between them. She tried at first to talk about misunderstandings, pressure, timing, mistakes people make chasing the wrong things. But underneath every word Marcus heard something else more clearly than regret. Recognition. She had finally realized the man she once dismissed as not enough had been carrying more discipline, patience, intelligence, and quiet authority than anyone she traded him for. Marcus didn't insult her. Didn't lecture her. He simply listened until the silence between them became too honest to escape. "I really thought I understood you," she admitted softly near the end. Marcus looked out across the skyline through the office windows, sunlight breaking fully across the city now. "I know," he answered gently. That hurt her more than anger ever could have. Months later, Marcus's life no longer revolved around proving anything to anyone. The legal battles settled privately. Whitmore Development lost multiple contracts after internal investigations exposed concealed ownership conflicts and unethical disclosures tied to the Davenport project. Ethan disappeared from public business circles almost overnight. Vanessa stayed mostly invisible too. Not ruined financially. Not destroyed dramatically. Just forced to live with the irreversible understanding that she abandoned the one man who had actually offered her stability without performance. Marcus never celebrated their collapse publicly because revenge had stopped mattering long before the final signatures dried. What mattered now was peace. On quiet mornings, he sometimes drove along the old transportation routes his grandfather once managed, watching freight lines move through the city while dawn light reflected against steel rails and warehouse windows. The system that nearly erased him had unknowingly led him back to his own inheritance, not just money or ownership, but identity. He had spent years allowing people to mistake restraint for weakness, calm for passivity, silence for limitation. Now he understood something they never did: the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who never needs everyone else to recognize his power. One evening near the start of summer, Marcus stood inside the renovated lakeside home he had quietly purchased months earlier through a private holding company no one connected to him. Warm sunset light spilled across hardwood floors while jazz played softly from hidden speakers. Near the fireplace sat an unopened box containing old wedding photos he had never bothered throwing away. Marcus looked at it for a long moment before sliding it gently onto a storage shelf inside the hallway closet. Not erased. Just finished. Then he walked toward the open glass doors overlooking the water where the evening air carried only silence and possibility now. If this story hit you harder than expected, let me know your thoughts below, and subscribe if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and people who finally stop being underestimated. Outside, the lake reflected the final orange light of sunset while Marcus stood calmly at the edge of his new life, hands in his pockets, completely at peace as the darkness settled behind him instead of around him.